Hi, my name's Alex O'Connor. I'm an atheist and host of the Within Reason podcast, and today I'm surrounded by 25 Christians.
You don't have to be incredibly philosophically minded to be able to defend the hope that is within you. These are some of the most important questions we could ever talk about. This is The Fourfold Disciple, a podcast from Emmett Ministries, where we aim to connect theology, apologetics, and cultural engagement for your growth as a disciple becoming a discipler of others. Now, before we get into the objections that Alex O'Connor provides to Christianity, I want to say just a few things. First and foremost, Alex O'Connor is very, very smart. He's brilliant. He's incredibly smart. He's a great philosopher. I think he's genuine in his desires to have intellectual honesty for the most part. He genuinely wants to have some deep conversations and think seriously about some of the things that he's talking about, even in this video. And I think that comes across in his desire to have conversations. He's not, it doesn't appear that he's often looking to just own people in the conversations that he's having. And I think that that's important to know. There are individuals in different videos that Jubilee does. And so if you're unfamiliar with this format, it's the objection is made, or the statement or claim is made. And then there's a circle of people around the person in the middle who's making the claim. And then a timer goes off, and you have the opportunity to run forward to try to get into the chair as fast as possible. And oftentimes in these types of settings, it feels like individuals are just trying to get like this real quick one-liner, like "I owned you" type of statement in, and it doesn't feel like that with Alex O'Connor. It never really comes across that way, and so I do appreciate that. I'll say that from the front. It never really feels like he's just trying to get that knockout, like "I owned you" type of statement in. And so I'll say that right from the get-go. Then I'll make this statement too about this video. My goal in this video, in doing this response, is not to provide formal arguments necessarily. And when I say formal, like the most robust philosophical arguments against the objections that he's providing. I'm not looking to break down the arguments that he's providing in the utmost philosophical way. That's not the intentions that I'm doing. My goal in this video is for you to be able to know that there are real responses that can happen to statements that are made against Christianity, to objections that are made against Christianity. If you want more on formal arguments against the claims that Alex O'Connor makes in this, I encourage you to check out this response video that Inspiring Philosophy did with a couple of the guys that were on this very debate. Now, my intention with not being incredibly formal in this is for you to understand that you don't have to be incredibly philosophically minded to be able to defend the hope that is within you. But that as a Christian who loves Jesus, that you can really defend the Christian faith with a desire to love God and to express that love and show others that love and show the hope that is within you with all truth and sincerity, with some basic knowledge. Now, we're going to get into some arguments. Now, you need to understand this. This doesn't mean that you ignore studying things. Just because I'm saying we're not going to get into formal arguments doesn't mean that, or I'm saying you shouldn't know things. You should know things if you're going to defend the hope that is within you. And I think if there's one thing to be said about this video is that at times there are individuals in this video who show that they do not know how to defend the hope that is within them. And it's a sad reality. And maybe we'll get into a little bit of that as they do come up. And so my hope for you as you watch this video, as you go through this, is that you know that one, that there are answers to the objections made against the Christian faith, and two, that you can defend the hope that is within you. Like that when someone maybe it's a classmate, maybe it's a coworker, maybe it's just some random person on the street, maybe it's a random person you watch on YouTube, when they make a claim against Christianity, that you can object to their objections, that you can defend the hope that is within you. And that idea comes from 1 Peter 3, where we're called to defend the hope that's within us, called to do it and honor the Lord our God with gentleness us and respect as we defend what's in us. And Jude calls us to contend for the faith that was once delivered to the saints. And so my hope is that you would be more confident in the Christian faith as we work through some of these ideas. And so let's get into Alex's objections to the Christian faith. And as we work through these, my goal is for you to have confidence in your ability to defend Christianity. Alex's first objection.
My first claim is that suffering makes God's existence unlikely.
When it comes to this objection, he starts off with this idea of suffering. And I think that the first thing we should acknowledge is that when we're answering any type of question about suffering, is that most people that are asking this question usually have some type of suffering in their background. And that oftentimes answering the question about suffering, and you must understand this, answering a question about suffering in a formal way usually does not actually resolve the issue, because someone who's asking a question about suffering has experienced suffering. And so behind every question is a questioner. It's someone asking the question. And so we must remember that behind every objection to the Christian faith is someone objectioning to the Christian faith. We got to remember there's a person behind the objection. And so that's foremost in our minds when we're doing any type of apologetics work. And so just keep that in mind. And so this question of suffering, though, and when we're answering the question of suffering, we have to remember that all suffering is a result of the fall. That as Christians, we know that there is no suffering if there is no fall. If Adam and Eve do not sin in the garden, there is no suffering. Suffering exists because of sin. Now, suffering is a result of the fall, yes, and we can understand that suffering probably has a purpose in human life, and O'Connor kind of even concedes that suffering could have a good outcome for humans, and so he shifts his objection to being about animal suffering, non-human animal suffering.
In particular, non-human animal suffering. Because I think that Christianity has a celebrated tradition of theodicies trying to explain why suffering exists. Yeah. Human free will, the development of the soul, higher order goods, all of this kind of stuff, none of which apply to the suffering of non-human animals.
And I'm sure that he would work through at different times the issue of human suffering, but he shifts it towards this to help us understand that that's the actual issue. And his statement is more like this: animal suffering makes God's existence unlikely. And oftentimes, as he's done in different places, he uses the example of the deer in the forest. And the guy that comes up first to wrestle with this claim is engaging with him, and he concedes that. He says, let's talk about the deer in the forest, right? And so the deer in the forest that's just running, and then a tree falls on it, and then a wildfire happens, and now this deer is alive, and it's going to be burnt alive, and it's suffering through all of this. And so why does that type of suffering exist? And since that type of suffering exists, that makes God's existence unlikely. So what do we do with that type of suffering? Well, as Christians, once again, first and foremost, we go, all types of suffering, including animal suffering, exists because of the fall. Exists because of the fall. That is, at the end of the day, what we can know and can say. And it's not God's fault. Now, we also have some answers that have been provided. I don't agree necessarily with this idea that C.S. Lewis puts forward, but it's an argument that he makes. It's not my idea, it's his argument. And his argument is that animals don't feel pain in the sense of suffering. Now, I have two dogs, and it's very obvious that they feel pain. The question is, can they perceive that pain as suffering? And suffering, and we usually attach a sense of morality to suffering, is can they sense pain as suffering? And we don't know for sure on that. We don't know if they have that, and others have done this, they've worked through this. We don't know if they have that higher level of intellectualism to understand a level of suffering, that what their experience isn't just pain, but is suffering. And so we perceive suffering as humans. We can feel that. We can sense that. We could even look at an animal that is going through excruciating pain and say that animal is suffering, but are they experiencing that type of suffering? Now, this is C.S. Lewis's argument. There's others that have presented this argument. Now, and I think it's an okay argument, but I don't know what to do with it since animals do appear to suffer. Because they do appear to suffer. I have dogs, like I said, and they do sometimes appear to suffer. Like if they get hurt, they appear to be in pain. They appear to be suffering. Especially if one hurts the other, or when you're eating food and it looks like they're really suffering because they're locked outside and they're looking in, like, man, I wish we could get in there and eat some of that food. But sometimes in the drastic example, right, with the animal in the woods that's being eaten alive or whatever it is, that's suffering in those scenarios, is that suffering in the same sense as when a human experiences suffering and has their falls and is in the woods and the fire's happening around them? Do they experience that same level of suffering? I don't think we can know the answer to that. Now, what I do think we can say is this: if they can or if they can't does not change who God is or God's character. If animals can or cannot experience suffering does not change who God is or God's character. It does not change that God is good. It does not change that God created all things. It does not change that He is the ruler of all things. It does not change that God has purposes for all suffering. We have no idea what His purposes might be for the animal in the woods going through that process of having a tree fall on it and the fire happening. We have no idea what His purposes might be for that. It may have a place in His grand scheme of things. And so I think we have to understand that this idea of animal suffering does not actually impact who God is or His character. And so it's also helpful to note for us, I think, that this objection, in some sense, with that in mind, seems very general. When you just kind of throw this tagline on there of animal suffering and its existence makes God's existence seem unlikely, it almost shuts down the conversation as a whole. It's like, okay, so what? Now, and I'm saying that from the perspective of we're having a conversation on the street, right? There's a guy that comes up first to talk to him, to Alex, and he gives a really good response, and they work through it. And so I think in a formal debate, right, there's a much more formal philosophical conversation that's going to happen there. But in our one-on-one debate that we're having just in the street, like, okay, so what? And I think maybe if we're interacting with this type of objection in the street, I think the appropriate response to it is this. If animal suffering exists, then God's existence seems unlikely. Okay, so what? If materialism exists, then the existence of the universe seems unlikely. Okay, now that we've cleared that out of the way, so what? Let's have a conversation. The universe exists, and I think it's unlikely that it exists based off your worldview. You think God's existence is unlikely based off of what you think about my worldview and animal suffering. And so unlikelies aren't great conversation starters. Let's talk about what we actually know, what's actually experienced. And so I think that we have to avoid these types of things when we're actually having what I would maybe call lay level, street level types of conversations. Unlikely is a term that will shut down actual conversation. And at the end of the day, and I really believe this, I think that this is maybe the thing that we have to do. If people want to die on this hill of saying, well, that makes God's existence unlikely, we have to start flipping the script, and this is where we have to start breaking worldviews. If that thing makes God's existence unlikely, then you have to understand materialism makes the existence of the universe unlikely, because nothing does not create everything that we see today. Nothing never results in something. That's kind of the conclusion of the cosmological argument. And so I think that for us that's the best way for us to maybe approach this idea of animal suffering making God's existence unlikely. There's some good responses to this by others. I encourage you particularly to go watch Inspiring Philosophy's response to this, because one of the guys in there works through, it's the very first guy, works through through how he was responding to it. And he gets into some deeper philosophy than I'm going to get into here right now. So let's move into Alex's second objection.
The next claim is that God commands genocide in the Bible.
So this is one that if you've spent maybe any time online, you've probably seen this objection to Christianity. Maybe you've even heard this objection, especially if you're on a college campus. This is one that I've heard probably dozens and dozens and dozens of times. Just people saying, I can't believe in the Bible because God commanded the genocide of people. It's actually one that I've had people debate me on many times online, and it's interesting. You even start. I like to ask the question, well, what do you mean by genocide? And we start working through that, and sometimes just even the redefining of genocide and going, well, that's not what's happening in the Old Testament context. What you just described as genocide, because usually they'll use like a definition of like the Holocaust. That's not what's happening in the Old Testament. It's not a racially defined destruction of people. That's not it. That's not what's happening in the Old Testament, particularly all in the conquest in the land of Canaan. And so I think just asking questions about this, like especially trying to figure out, what do people actually know when they say this? Are they just saying it because it's a trope they've heard? And so Alex O'Connor's not saying it because it's a trope he's heard. He's studied it. He's looked at it. And so he's working through this. He's asking this question because he thinks it's a good objection. And so how do we respond? How should we think about this question of Christianity, or a question challenging Christianity, I should say? And so I think first and foremost, we have to understand this, that God is the author of life. And we see this idea in Scripture time and time again. We see it in Job, that he is the author of life, and he has the right to give life, and he has the right to take life. Every breath is given from God, and it is a gift from God. He is the one who gives it. He's the one who takes it away. And so at the core principle of understanding who we are and who God is, we must understand that he is the creator and we are the creation. Job says, as he's going through the most intense suffering, he says, shall we not expect also evil from God if we've received good? And that's a kind of a paraphrase. Like he's identifying, like, we've gotten good from God. Should we not expect evil as well? And it's not to say that God causes evil, but that God allows these things to happen in our lives. And so Job went through some horrible events. And so we need to understand who God is when it comes to some of these types of things. And so God is the giver and taker of life. He has the right to do that. That's a fundamental principle. Now, we also need to understand some context to the Old Testament and what's happening when we're thinking about these so-called genocide passages. Now, when Alex O'Connor says God commands genocide in the Old Testament, he's avoiding the fact that what's actually happening here is that God is the commander and ruler of the people, and that he's pulling them out of Egypt and taking them into the land that he has promised to them. This is their land that was promised to Abraham. And so we also need to remember that. If the first thing we must remember is that God is the author and giver of life, the second thing we must remember is that he is the ruler of the people, giving them their land back, which means they must drive out those who would take them away from worshiping him. Now, couple other things. When God gives them this land, and he's calling them to drive out the Canaanites of the land of Canaan, he's not doing that because the Canaanites were just these nice people who were just kind of going about their way. Right? That's not who the Canaanites were. The Canaanites weren't just kind of like chilling in the land, right? Like hanging out, having a good time. They weren't just sharing with each other, who loved one another. They weren't loving their neighbors themselves. Like that's not who these people were. And I'm not saying that because the Bible says that. I'm saying that because that's the understanding of like what all of the ancient Near Eastern texts say about the Canaanite people. The Canaanite people were evil. Like there's no like hiding that. Not just from a biblical standpoint, but like the non-Christian, non-Old Testament writings about who these people were is that they were barbaric, that they were evil. And they did a lot of horrible, horrible things. And so when God is calling them to when God is calling his people to eradicate the Canaanites from this land, what he's actually calling them to do is enact his judgment on those who are wicked in this land, who've rebelled against his ways and righteousness. He's calling them to destroy those who would attract his people away from worshiping him and into evil, idolatrous, pagan practices. And I think one of the things we struggle with this is because we really underestimate how evil paganism in this time was. And I think we actually still underestimate how evil paganism is. I think we take too lightly how unholy so much of the world is today, and that's a whole nother thing. But we underestimate how evil these people were. From human sacrifice to practicing demonic things, like these people were evil. They were obstinate to the things of God. Like they were not doing righteousness, not in the sense of like they stole from each other, but like they stole from each other and then killed each other. Like and like while they were alive, were sacrificing one another. Like these were evil people, from pedophilia to human sacrifice. Evil people. And the second thing that reason why I think we struggle with this is because we're such a hyper individualistic age that we really struggle with the idea that an entire culture would be deemed evil, that a whole culture would be understood as evil. And I think we struggle with that an ideology, that a whole ideology would make someone evil, that it would make individuals evil. And I think that we forget that there really are evil worldviews and that whole people groups are under those schemes. And so when the people are sent into Canaan, that's what they're being sent into. And that there really were people from every age up that were evil in this. And these people hated God. All of them, men, women, and children, hated God. And they were deserving of his judgment. These people, from human sacrifice to pedophilia to bestiality, were in rebellion against God and his ways. We must remember that. That's what God is commanding his people to go in and eradicate, to push out of the land. And he's sending his people in to judge them, not to commit genocide. We got to remember that piece of this. These people were not righteous at all. William Lane Craig, who's a famous apologist and philosopher, he points out that this comes after the account of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. And he does an interesting thing that he points out that when Abraham's asking about the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, I think it's Abraham anyway, he's asking, if there's just 10 righteous men, would you not destroy the city? And he says, I would not destroy it even if there are just 10 righteous men in the city. I would not destroy these places. And he does so to emphasize that God would withhold his wrath of Sodom and Gomorrah if there were just 10 righteous people there. And so he's doing that to help us understand that God would have withheld his wrath to these people if they were not wicked. God's not just destroying them because they're righteous. Like he's destroying them because they really are wicked. Like they deserved this. That's why they're being destroyed. That's what's happening. And he also says this. Craig says this. He points out that the Canaanites had over 400 years while the Israelites were in captivity in Egypt to turn from wickedness and to Yahweh. They would have known of Yahweh. They would have known of him. They probably would have heard the oral traditions at this point. Maybe you've even had some written things that had been said at some point. But they didn't. They never turned. They never repented of paganism, of their wicked ways. They never turned to the God of Abraham. And at the end of the day, if he is the God of Abraham, and he decides that they have remained in their wickedness and not repented, not recanted of their wickedness, then he has the right to judge them for that. Now, there are scholars who have done lots of things on whether or not there were women and children in these places. can't say for sure. There's questions about those things. We don't know for sure. We do know this, that the Israelites actually do fail. We do end up seeing Canaanites appear at different times throughout the history of the people. We know they succeed in some ways in wiping them out, and they fail in other ways, and that there's warnings against intermarrying with them. And so there's lots of good things done out there. And so another resource I want to recommend to you is this really short video by Gavin Ortlund. And so hopefully that'll help you be able to think through some of just even this idea of the conquesting Canaan. And so as you come across this objection to Christianity in regards to God commanding genocide, I think the thing that's best for us to do is emphasize who God is. God is righteous. God is holy. And when God sends his people into the land of Canaan to judge the wicked, he's doing that. He's sending them in to judge wicked people. These people were pedophiles. These people were committing acts of bestiality. They were committing acts of human sacrifice. And God was sending his people in to judge them and to cleanse the land. That is what he was doing. His people were to remain holy and unstained from the world. And the way that he was going to ensure that was by eradicating the wicked people who would have drawn him away from himself. And so that's why God judges them in such a seemingly harsh way. The wages of sin is death. And then again, and I even think this, I didn't point this out, but the suffering issue and this issue, both of them point to the gospel. You're right, there is suffering. But Jesus Christ has come and he has suffered and died for your sins so that you don't have to suffer. There will be a day where there will be no more suffering. We'll enter into the presence of God and have life everlasting with him. You know what? Wickedness is evil. Sin deserves death. Jesus is the only one who did not deserve to die, and he did. Because of your sin and my sin, and by faith we can have life everlasting. These are just easy gospel connections. And I want us to remember, when we're doing apologetics, never separate apologetics from our gospel proclamation. They go hand in hand. I think the great danger in YouTube apologetics and apologetic debates is that we'll separate apologetic arguments from telling the better story, from telling the gospel. We can't do that. And so let's make sure we're doing both, defending the faith and sharing the good news of Christ and how people can come into loving Jesus and having life with him forever and ever. Next objection that Alex makes is this.
My next claim is that there is insufficient evidence to believe in the resurrection.
I kind of find this one funny because every now and then I'll see this clip come up on YouTube.
Something very strange happened on Easter morning, because how do we explain the fact that this man gets crucified by the Romans and then people claim to see him after he died and were willing to be put to death for that belief? Now, okay, maybe he didn't die. Unlikely. As they say, the Romans knew how to kill people. Okay, so likelihood is that he was actually crucified. And then a few days later, people are claiming to see him. Maybe they're lying, but then you don't tend to go to death for something you know to be a lie. You're willing to be put to death for things that you think are true, that are false, but very rarely are people willing to die for beliefs that they don't actually believe themselves. That doesn't really happen. So they probably weren't lying.
And so Alex himself kind of agrees, like the resurrection is maybe like one of the better arguments for the Christian faith, which is kind of funny that he says there's insufficient evidence to believe in the resurrection. And so, I'm just disappointed in this, though, not necessarily that Alex brings this claim forward and how it was defended. There's this lady that comes forward, and I'm not going to belittle her and her argument, but her, and we're not even going to play it, but her defense of the resurrection of Christ is an example of why you have to be ready to defend the hope within you with real arguments, like arguments that are good and sound. We have to know what the Christian faith actually is about. And I believe she's probably a believer. She probably loves the Lord Jesus Christ, but she did not know what she was stepping into. And it seems like she just was not prepared to actually defend the evidence for the resurrection. We got to be ready to defend this, because Paul says that if the resurrection did not happen, our faith is in vain. We should drink, for tomorrow we die. The resurrection of Christ is of most significance. And so I want want to provide just 6 things for us to remember when we're talking about the resurrection of Christ. These are the 6 most important things. I think that this is sufficient evidence for us to conclude that Jesus Christ did in fact rise from the grave. First and foremost, Jesus was crucified. No one's denying that. He was crucified under Pontius Pilate. No one is denying that fact. Second, Jesus was buried. He was buried in a tomb. It seems to be, tradition says that. No one's denying that fact, that it's kind of the normal thing that happens, that people usually die, then they're buried, and that the Jews, for some reason, did allow Jesus' body to be taken, to be buried. The third thing we know is that Jesus' tomb was found empty. It was empty, and that the Jews began to formulate a lie that his disciples had stolen the body. We know that took place, that was a normal thing that kind of was happening in the first century, that a lie was promoted saying that. Fourth, the conversion of Paul. Paul was not a favorable person to Christianity. He did not like Christians. We see him at the stoning of Stephen in approval as the coats are laid down at his feet as Stephen is stoned. He was anti-Christian. He was the chief of Jews, right? And he converts to Christianity, changes the world. Paul is like one of the most famous Christians in all of history. Conversion of Paul is a piece of evidence, I think, for the resurrection, because he claims he sees the resurrected Christ. We also have the conversion of James, who is a skeptic of Jesus, right? When Jesus' ministry is happening, he doesn't believe him. He's not there for him. James leads the church in Jerusalem. And then the 6th piece of evidence is this. There's over 500 claimed to have seen the resurrected Christ. And so Paul makes that claim in 1 Corinthians 15. 1 Corinthians 15, 1 through 9 is kind of this chief passage for us when we think about the resurrection. Paul claims that there are 500 of whom some are still alive that you could go talk to, right? And ask about the resurrection. I think that this is one of those pieces of evidence for us that we go, okay, well, what do we do with this? And so Alex O'Connor says this is insufficient evidence. And I say, well, what more evidence would we want? I mean, a video, right? We don't have that. Maybe photos. We also don't have that. But we have a skeptic. We have someone not who wasn't even a skeptic. Paul was like anti-Christian. He was anti-Jesus, and he converts to Christianity. He converts because he claims to have seen the resurrected Christ. James converts because he sees the resurrected Christ. His skeptical brother converts. And then we have the scene of the 500, those 500 claiming to see it, like Paul saying, go talk to them. This happened. And I would add maybe a 7th, like what happens to the apostles after this? Like, they all go out and they die these horrible deaths, except the apostle John. Like they all die these horrible, brutal deaths for something they supposedly made up, a lie. If you're going to make something up and you're about to be crucified upside down, maybe as they're about to nail you upside down to the cross, that's the time to go, hey, we actually stole the body. I'll show you where the body's at. Or maybe if you're about to be speared to death, that's the time to go, hey, actually, we made it up. I lied. It's all made up. We stole the body. I'll show you where it's at. They don't do this, though. They truly believed that Jesus had died on the cross. He was buried, and after 3 days he rose from the grave, and that he sent them out to all the nations to make disciples, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and that they were to go and offer everlasting life, teaching all the world to obey the commands of Christ. And they died for it. Their lives were ended for it, and the world was changed because of it. Maybe, this thought's occurring to me, the most sufficient evidence for the resurrection is the reality that the church exploded in the way that it did. Bart Ehrman has a book, I think it's called The Triumph of Christianity. I think that's the name of it. And it's a good book about how Christianity exploded in the ancient world. And it happens in such a short period of time as Christianity expands so fast. And I think that we should ignore that reality and I think it's a helpful piece of evidence in helping us understand that the disciples and the early followers of Christianity really believed Jesus rose from the grave. And I think that that's sufficient evidence. And when we're interacting with people on the street, in conversations, coworkers, classmates, whoever it may be, I think we have to point to those really 6 things and identifying like, look, you have to do something with this. These are the historical facts. This is what we know about this era. And so you have to do something with it. Whether it happened or not is up to you to decide. You can come up with a conclusion. Maybe the body was stolen. Maybe they made it up. Or maybe he really did rise from the grave. Fourth claim that Alex makes is this.
An next assertion is that Jesus never claimed to be God.
You know, I'm really disappointed. David Wood was supposed to be doing a debate with Alex O'Connor on this. I hope that it ends up happening maybe in an online platform on whether or not Jesus claimed to be God, but it's not happening anymore. It's supposed to be happening through modern day debate. If you've never seen any of their stuff, they do a really good job. But I'll just read this for you from Mark chapter 14, verse 61 through 64. This is Jesus before the council, and it says this: "But he remained silent and made no answer. Again, the high priest asked him, 'Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?' And Jesus said, 'I am. And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven.' And the high priest tore his garment and said, 'What further witness do we need? You have heard this blasphemy. What is your decision?' And they all condemned him as deserving death." You know, Jesus before the council here, he's just flat out affirming who he is as the Son of Man, as the Messiah, as the Lord himself. And he is adamantly defending the position that he is God in the flesh. And Jesus does this in the other Gospels, right? He says, before Abraham I was, I am. I have a video recently on the 7 I am statements, how I think these are explicit statements about his divine status. You know, Jesus, as he enters into Jerusalem and the triumphal entry, he does not deny the affirmation given to him by the people, which is him affirming the claim that they give to him as the Son of God. You know, so you have all of that. It's just time and time again. Yes, Jesus never says, "I am God." He doesn't say that to his disciples, but he says statements like this that are just clearly pointing out that he is not denying the fact that he is God in the flesh, that he is the God-man. And so Jesus 100% claims to be God. He understood his role as the God-man, as the second person of the Trinity, to come and to die for sinners. And so this is kind of becoming an old trope. You know, Wes Huff has this most recent clip, and I thought this was really funny in a recent debate. And this is kind of becoming what Alex O'Connor is doing whenever he's saying things. And so watch this.
Bart Ehrman claims that the synoptics don't claim Jesus is God, other than when they claim Jesus is God. And when they do claim Jesus is God, they can't be claiming Jesus is God because Jesus never claims to be God.
And so the more and more we get into this type of debate where we say Jesus never claimed to be God, it's like, except when he did. Like, and so, you know, just be aware that this is happening more and more, and we need to be ready to defend the reality that Jesus did in fact claim to be God. Now, the last thing that happens in these videos is that the person in the middle, so Alex in this case, gets to pick someone from the crowd and bring them forward, and they get to present a claim. And this is where things get off the rails. And so I saw a thing, and like it was a pinned comment, and it said, "Just wait till you get to the last objection." And when he calls on someone, I was like, "Oh goodness!" And so I was ready for this. And he calls on someone. He comes forward, and the claim comes up, and I could not believe it. And so here it is.
This chap over here just seems also very knowledgeable, very enthusiastic, and philosophically minded as well. Why don't we bring you back?
So, my claim, which might bother some people in this circle, and this is why I thought maybe we could find a little bit of middle ground here.
Like it.
Because I represent a form of Christianity that a lot of people don't even consider as Christian.
Uh-huh.
I'm a Latter-day Saint, also known as a Mormon.
Awesome.
And my claim is that the restored gospel, also known as Mormonism, provides a conception of God that is more rationally defensible than any other creedal Christian sect.
Wow. So I thought, you know, right off the bat, let me just say this. I don't know why Jubilee did this. Supposedly there were a handful of Mormons, members of the Church of Latter-day Saints, and I'll say Mormons. They this is a rebrand. The Church of Latter-day Saints is trying to say they're members of the Church of Latter-day Saints. It's a rebrand. Mormons are that's what they've always been called. That's a rebrand. We won't go into that. Maybe in another time. But I think Jubilee probably knew what they were doing in some sense with this. I think Alex O'Connor probably knew what he was doing in some sense with this. He's kind of been cheeky with this in recent videos he's been doing. But the guy that he calls up, he's really smart. He's done some good debates. And so his claim is that Mormonism provides a conception of God that's more rationally defensible than any other Christian sect. And so, first and foremost, before we get into anything, though, I want to make this statement. Mormons aren't Christians, and that's identified even in his opening statements, where he identifies that Mormonism is not like creedal Christianity. If it's not like creedal Christianity, it is not Christian. That's kind of the point. Like at the end of the day, where Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholicism and Protestantism, we disagree on some really big things, issues of justification, praying to the saints, icons, and so many other things in between there, from the office of the papacy to sola scriptura or different issues within authority. Those are really big matters of issue. We still all follow underneath the umbrella of Christendom, and we still have ecumenical councils. And we'll get maybe into that at another point in time in a video in the future, especially if that's something somebody wants to hear more about. But Mormons don't fall into any of that, and he's affirming that. He's saying we don't fall into any of the creedal Christian categories. And so it's like, so you just start off by saying we're not Christian. And so Mormons aren't Christian. They deny the Trinity. They deny basic Christian beliefs. And I have a podcast on that reality that came out a while ago, and you can go back and listen to that. And so just let's start with maybe this premise just to refute this. I don't want to get too far into this. Alex says I don't know a whole lot about the Mormon God, so I'm not going to get into what his response is. But just maybe for us to think about this in case you ever interact with this. The Mormon God is not self-existent. He's actually a created God, because at one point in time, he himself was a creature who became God himself. And since he became God, he is not self-existent. And so from the get-go within that, we have a major theological issue, because in theology proper, the understanding of who God is that he is self-existent. He is ase. He is without need. And so the Mormon God is not that. He is with need because he is created. And in fact, the Mormon God, not only is he created, he then creates a world, and that world will have a person, and maybe multiple people, right? Like there are Mormons who believe they will become gods of their own planet. And so there's this infinite regress of other gods within Mormonism. And so the eternal God versus the Mormon God are two completely different spheres, because the Mormon God is just one of, I guess, maybe billions and trillions. I don't even know how many gods there are within Mormonism, because of the infinite regress of how many there potentially are and could be and will be, I guess. And so it's irrational to even think along those lines, because, how many gods there could be. And so the Mormon God is just one of many, and he offers a real issue. And he offers what's called the infinite regress problem. And so the Christian God is the eternal God, and he is the only God who has ever been, who ever will be. He always has been and always is. And so when we're thinking about questions of rationality and thought, we want to think about the only God who has been, because if a God is created, that means that he is not the final authority for all logic and thought, that there was one before him who was the Logos himself, or I guess in Mormonism could be herself in some sense. And so in Christianity, the eternal Logos himself is the eternal God. And so he is the eternal standard. He is the eternal creator of all. And so this is a really interesting argument, because it's almost one that's just kind of out in left field. And it's like, what are you talking about? Mormonism doesn't even have a seat at the table when it comes to this conversation about rationality, because there's so many major issues within Mormonism, from the reliability to the Book of Mormon to the infinite regress problem of how many gods there are, to the issue of whether or not the prophets have lied, and all of these things that, or had false prophecies. I guess not necessarily lied, but false prophecies. I guess a false prophecy would be a lie, but just all of these issues within Mormonism itself, that it's hard to even begin to engage a conversation about whether or not the Mormon God is more rationally defensible than any other Christian sect. And so when it comes to engaging Mormonism as a whole, I think that this concept, the statement made here, it's one to go, I don't know a whole lot about Mormonism, and so I don't want to get into the weeds of what you're saying. I just want to maybe work through this statement. Was the God that you're talking about once a man? And the answer to that in their perspective, in their theological perspective, is yes. And so then you have to start working through what that means. Because if the God that they worship was once a man, then then that means he is not self-existent. And if he's not self-existent, he is not ase, meaning that he is need. He is need to have been once created, and he is not worthy of worship. And it creates a whole new problem for who he is as a God. And so the eternal God, the God of the Scriptures, is not like that at all. He is holy. He is without need. He didn't need to create us. He didn't need to create me. He didn't need to create you, yet he chose to. He created the world because he chose to, out of his own desire, to magnify his name, for his own glory, and out of love, he created the world to have a people unto himself. And so Mormons, a really interesting argument here. I'm sure the guy that did this probably did a reaction video and broke down his argument a little bit more, but I'm not going to go too much further into this. There's probably more to it, but I'm not going to spend much more time on it. And so overall, I think this video is a great video. I love the idea of these types of videos where you're bringing people together who disagree on things to talk about the most important things in life. I think that these are some of the most important questions we could ever talk about. And so I hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure you like and subscribe. Give me a comment. Let me know what you think. And hopefully you stuck around all the way to the end. I know this is a little bit of a longer one. And so hopefully this encouraged you to defend the Christian faith, to know that you can defend the faith in the street, and that there are good answers to the objections that the world makes, and that you can defend the hope that is within you.
For more resources, visit emmettministries.org, and make sure you follow us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and subscribe on YouTube for more weekly content from Emmett Ministries.